Our project is centered around secondary education in Western Africa with a focus on mathematics in particular.
We had the opportunity to speak with Malade Asibodu, who grew up in Nigeria and taught in South Africa. She told us of her experiences learning and teaching in countries other than the United States.
She came to the United States to receive her bachelor's and master's after completing her primary and secondary schooling in Nigeria.
She taught in South Africa for 5 years at the African Leadership Academy, a private school, focused on training and preparing students for leadership positions. She mentioned that this school breeds a sort of pride and celebration of African heritage. To give some background, the African Leadership Academy is an incredibly diverse international school. It has rigorous curriculum and selective admission. This prestigious institution created a very close-knit group of both students and teachers. They place value on courses related to math, African studies, and entrepreneurial leadership with a Pan-African view.
Malade has taken her experiences gathered there and is now pursuing a PhD in math education here at Michigan State with the hopes of discovering community-centered curriculum and project-based learning styles. Prior to meeting with Malade, we did some research, and according to UNICEF Nigeria has the highest rate of non-enrolled students in the world. Only 47% of children are enrolled through 9th grade, where it stops being officially mandatory. This is very different from the United States, where you have to be in school until you are at least 16.
There's also a large gender gap in enrollment, especially in the northern part of the country. This is partially due to cultural norms that claim women are better suited for staying at home while men should be more educated. Poor families might need their daughters to work at home as well. Early marriage and pregnancy also stops girls from finishing their education on time.
Many students in Nigeria move abroad for college, just like Malade did. One reason for this is that professors at universities in Nigeria go on strike quite frequently. Whenever this happens, classes are canceled until the strike is over. As a result, a typical 4-year degree could take 6 to 8 years to finish. This doesn't happen in countries like the United States, so the stability appeals to Nigerian students.
So South Africa, according to an article by The Economist, has a lot of racial and economic disparities. It's actually considered one of the worst educational systems among the world's wealthy countries. And currently, the government is working a lot on improving early education programs, so preschool access, but the secondary education still has a lot of problems.
Many students in public schools in South Africa are not even passing their core classes. For example, in 2014, only 3% of 9th graders passed the national math tests. Because of this, lots of students retake classes or end up even dropping out, even though the overall enrollment rate is pretty high.
So although apartheid is no longer the national law in South Africa, there's a lot of leftover racial segregation and tension because of that, kind of similar to what we see in the United States with segregated neighborhoods and urban versus rural disparities. So there's a lot of unequal resources in the public schools. Another issue is that a lot of teacher unions are really corrupt, especially with how they go about hiring teachers.
A number of private schools, like the one where Malade taught, have started to offer students a better choice. When we sat down to interview with Malade, we had high hopes of finding out more about the differences and similarities in education systems in Nigeria, South Africa, and the United States.
Malade's school in Nigeria was very homogenous, far away from the big city, and didn't have much technology. It was a government-run boarding school, which is the norm there, where the so-called day schools are seen as being for just the fancy people. The families had visiting day once a month. Malade's dad encouraged her a lot in her education, especially with math. She also mentioned that there seemed to be less of a stigma around girls studying in the STEM field there than there is here, and that she found herself thriving and being supported.
We also found it interesting that there's no quote-unquote math people in Nigeria. That label in the science skill does not exist. Unlike the US, many people don't believe that math is an inherent skill, and rightfully so. Oftentimes, in elementary or middle school, people are told whether or not they're good at math pretty explicitly. This is not a custom or common occurrence in Nigeria.
The African Leadership Academy has many goals that differ from the goals of the government schools. This academy exemplified leadership and taught a Pan-African curriculum in order for students to understand not only where they live, but the nation as a whole. This curriculum encouraged global awareness and cultural competence because the students learned about people and places all around Africa. In addition, the students themselves were extremely diverse, and this contributed to the experiences that they could share. The existence of the Pan-African curriculum allowed students to remove their cultural lens and really think outside of the box.
Many students take a gap year before attending the African Leadership Academy, and during this year they engage in nonprofit organizations. This adds to the experiences that they can share with each other about Africa as a whole. Most of the teachers at the school were both male and Nigerian, and the only female teacher that Malade had taught a home economics class. Malade and her friends, all girls, excelled in math. Malade did not experience a gender gap as we would have imagined she would if she were in the United States. There was no stigma placed on her for being a girl pursuing a difficult subject, and without this discrimination, she had endless opportunities. In compiling our research and information on Malade's experience, we were surprised to see that she had such a positive experience growing up in a school system that was so different than the one that she taught in. It led us to reconsider our previous assumptions that affluent schools with more resources are bound to be the only schools that children can learn at effectively.
Malade had a very good experience teaching at the private school in South Africa, but she saw many problems in the government schools. Students who had been in schooling under the government school struggled and experienced frustration coming into the private schools where Malade was teaching. Some of these students were top of their class and came into the private schools with a preconceived notion that they would succeed with little issue. Their assumptions were inaccurate, and these students were thrown off to a great extent when they were falling behind and were some of the worst students in the new private school.
In contrast with government schools, the African Leadership Academy where Malade taught was based on 5 principles: humility, compassion, excellence, diversity, and integrity. These principles establish a culture in the school that allows students to grow and prosper to their full ability.
So the African Leadership Academy was really unique because it was a boarding school, and unlike in Nigeria where they're really common, in South Africa they're very unusual. But because there were students from all over the world, especially all over Africa, it really had to be a boarding school. It was also very unusual because its curriculum was developed really just for that school and very different from the standardized government curriculum that's used in the public schools in South Africa, which is so standardized even down to the exact tests they take and the textbooks they have to use.
Additionally, students at the African Leadership Academy were really competitive. There were only a few scholarships available, so that really increased the motivation to get good marks. Another large influence on the competitiveness and rigor of the curriculum were the parents. Much like the places in the United States, they were heavily involved with the education of their child.
Malade told us that the parents would often email the teachers and were very involved in their students' performance. So the email, because a lot of them were not nearby. And she attributed this to the fact that the parents are paying a very high tuition and really wanted to see results coming from that.
Since the school was an international school, not all students and parents spoke the same language as their peers. This language barrier was overcome by an inclusive curriculum. Differences were not only expected, but they were celebrated.
The culture of the African Leadership Academy was extremely different than the culture of government schools and the rest of the population. At home and in their daily lives outside of school, it was unheard of to question sexual orientation or religion or anything that might be viewed as controversial. However, at school, they were able to question anything and everything. Malade told us that some girls would dye their hair bright pink to freely express themselves and to diverge from the norm. You should try that, Cassie.
I've done it before.
Most importantly, they did all of this rebellion, so to speak, in a respectful way. They were never disrespectful of their authorities, and they never caused harm to others. Rather, everyone in the school was accepting and understanding of personal decisions made by each individual.
This academy also focused on helping students find a career and a skill that they not only excelled in, but liked. There was no monetary motivation in selecting a career path. The United States take note. For that reason, it is important that students take a gap year prior to pursuing their post-secondary education. This gap year is often a time for students to travel and gain new experiences that aren't necessarily academic.
Another interesting thing to note is that students were encouraged to question everything and to never take things at face value. They had this quote-unquote fight the system mentality, as Malade explained. This led to a few struggles with authority, but they were encouraged. This is night and day from a typical United States school response to students that would push back. This difference can also stem from the fact that the academy was not a public school and did not have to abide by the state rules and values.
So much like we expected, there are a lot of disparities between the educational systems in Nigeria and South Africa and the United States. We saw these differences not only in the curriculum that the schools used at different levels, as well as the demographics of students and teachers, but also in the motivation level of students and teachers, as well as the school cultures that were created. We believe that the United States could learn a lot of things from the African Leadership Academy, specifically encouraging students to draw their own conclusions about topics and letting teachers be more of a guide to exploring course materials rather than just very strict authoritarian figures.
We were inspired by the fact that despite discouraging statistics, Malade and other South Africans are fighting for change and improved education for all.